Good Monday evening, everybody. I'm KHOU 11 meteorologist Tim Pandages here with your tropical update. We're talking about two systems, Tropical Storm Idalia and Major Hurricane Franklin, a Category 4, could be borderline Category 5 in the Atlantic this hour. Today is Monday, August the 28th, 2023. All right, here's a look at the basin. We've got Tropical Storm Idalia at this hour, still a high-end tropical storm. There's aircraft flying around almost constantly getting new data, so we're waiting on an upgrade likely to a Category 1 hurricane in the next couple of hours. Winds currently with that at 70 miles per hour. And then we've got Category 4 Franklin with winds of 150 miles per hour. Very impressive specimen out there in the Atlantic Basin. Thankfully, not bearing down on any U.S. coastline, and it should steer hopefully all clear of Bermuda over the next couple of days as it moves to the north. All right, here's a closer look of Tropical Storm Idalia on the infrared satellite imagery. Why this is helpful? Well, number one is we can see this 24 hours a day. A visible satellite obviously is only usable when the sun is up. But this is taking the temperature of the cloud tops. Why that's important for us to monitor the intensity of this storm is when we get colder cloud tops, that means the thunderstorm activity is more intense. Hence, intensification is underway. So what we're seeing here are some bursts of convection or colder cloud tops. You can kind of see it bubbling on up here. The whites and even some pinks there. We got a most recent convective burst here right over the western portions of Cuba. So land is being impacted at this time. Western Cuba, gusty winds, heavy rain, and a storm surge coming into the east of the center that's blowing off to the south side, the south coast of Cuba right now as this starts to lift to the north. It has started moving north at 8 miles per hour. 24 hours ago, this was just meandering in the northwest Caribbean, so it's just about to build into the southeastern portions of the Gulf of Mexico with ongoing convective bursts there. It's a rather large system. When you go from north to south, its diameter is about a little over 400 miles. So it's a large storm, will likely get a little bit larger as it gains latitude as it heads towards the Florida Gulf Coast in the next 36 hours. As I mentioned, there is aircraft currently in it flying a mission, the Air Force Hurricane Hunter Reserve, and they're doing a loop in there, dropping instrumentation to get a bearing on the pressure, as well as the winds, sustained winds there. And that data is what we'll use to likely upgrade the system to a Category 1 hurricane in the coming hours. Here's visible satellite imagery. This is a 12-hour loop. Of course, you can see the sun going down there. We lose imagery. But in the last couple frames before the sun goes down, you can see the bubbling up of convection of thunderstorm activity as this begins to build north. It's been sitting over very, very warm water. So why hasn't it intensified or even rapidly intensified over the last 24 hours when it's been sitting in such a high fuel environment? Well, we've had some wind shear that's been working on the system, which is good. We cheer the shear. That's coming in out of the north and west. So what that's doing is preventing the storm from standing up straight and having good posture. When it's standing up straight, or stacked as we call it, it's able to ventilate properly and take advantage, full advantage of the ideal environmental conditions that are currently in place here, aside from the wind shear. Now, this is not going to last forever. As it builds to the north, the wind shear drops, and what we're left with is a moist profile of the atmosphere and even warmer sea surface temperatures that it's not only at the skin, extends down over 100 feet, meaning that as the storm intensifies and it mixes up the ocean, it will continuously mix up warm waters, meaning the fuel source, at least for its duration over the waters, will be endless. And that is not good, because that could provide the possibility, or more so likelihood, of rapid intensification going forward as it bears down on Florida's Gulf Coast. That wind shear is also trying to pull in some dry air. Switching up the satellite imagery again, and we've got water vapor. In the rust color here is dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. When that wind shear tries to punch into the circulation and drive some of that dry air in, that can choke off the circulation a little bit. We're not really seeing that. So far, Idalia has done a good job of keeping the dry air off to its north and west. And as that wind shear drops, that possibility of that dry air getting entrained is less and less likely. So there's really not a lot ahead of this that could weaken it. Now, one thing I will say, if it does get to become a major hurricane, which it's currently forecast to do, when we get major hurricanes, they go through something called an eye wall replacement cycle. this can be good and bad in terms of intensification at landfall. If in fact at landfall it starts to undergo an eye wall replacement cycle, that typically leads to a brief period of weakening as the eye wall collapses and a larger eye wall builds in to replace it. During that time of replacement, it usually either plateaus intensification or drops just a little bit. So unfortunately, that may be all we have here as we go forward in time, because look what lies out ahead of the forecast track. We've got water temperatures, which, by the way, you only need 80 degrees or warmer to facilitate the heat transfer from the ocean, the latent heat release to the energy of a developing storm. So we certainly have that, but notice as you tick farther north, it gets warmer and warmer right up to the Big Bend area where that water is warm, but shallow, but enough to provide intensification likely right up to landfall. And as I mentioned, it's not just the skin of the ocean that extends down to a great depth, and when it's warm, deep water, the likelihood of rapid intensification grows. You can see it on the scale here with the oranges coming into play here. That makes it a little more likely for intensification to occur. So here's the official forecast track that came out around 4 p.m. this afternoon Central Time. This is the intermediate advisory at 7 o'clock, just giving us an update on the stats here, which haven't really changed, although a slight drop in the central pressure has been made evident from passes from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. So nothing has really changed here in terms of the overall track scenario. You will notice the cone has gotten a little bit more narrow. That's because confidence grows as we get a little bit closer to landfall time. But this is a big change since yesterday, as it's now forecast to become a major hurricane just ahead of landfall. So between here at 1 a.m. on Wednesday with 120 mile per hour winds and 12 hours later at 1 p.m., we're already over land at that time down to a Cat 1 90 mile per hour storm, which is nothing to shrug off. Between there and landfall, we could easily see this get stronger than 120 miles per hour. And I will tell you, an intensifying landfalling hurricane is much worse than a hurricane that is making landfall on a weakening scenario, okay? So if it peaks here and starts to weaken, that would be better. I mean, none of these scenarios are great, but a weakening landfalling storm is better than an intensifying one. And we just saw that on the other side of the Gulf about a week ago today almost, of Harold. That was an intensifying tropical storm upon landfall, which brought about slightly worse impacts for South Texas. So again, Category 3, 120 mile per hour winds. The focus has been on Florida. And yes, they will see the highest impact from Idalia when Idalia is at its strongest. Overland and then re-emerging potentially off the southeast coastline now brings about the risk for impacts for Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and still at a moderate grade tropical storm at this point. And we'd be looking at storm surge potential when it's located here out to the north and northeast with the onshore winds coming in ahead of it. Myrtle Beach, Charleston, very susceptible to storm surge, so we can see that there. You can already see here in the yellow shading along the coast, tropical storm watches are up for Savannah up to Charleston. Here's a look at the intensity forecast put out from the National Hurricane Center. Here's where we currently are, 70 mile per hour tropical storm, high-end tropical storm. And then we're up to Cat 1 by tomorrow morning, 85 mile per hour winds. That's quite a jump, 70 to 85. And then a 20 mile per hour jump in 12 hours. So we're getting some intensification all the way up to a Cat 3, potentially peaking of 120 miles per hour just before landfall, pre-dawn on Wednesday. So how are our global models looking at things now? We're getting model agreement, okay? Big Bend area seems to be favored by both the GFS, here's the latest run of that, showing it due south of Tallahassee in the Big Bend area, although a little bit farther to the west than what you'll see here with the latest run of the European model that's just slightly farther to the east. That's the big worry here, especially for impacts in the Tampa Bay area. If we see this jog a little bit farther to the east, and memory serves us well what happened with Fort Myers and Ian. We saw similar jogs to the east and then obviously a turn right into that area with Ian just last year. So we'll have to monitor this carefully, and it's really going to be a nowcasting type of event to see what it does in real time and adjust the track as we get closer and closer. How about all those different spaghetti plots here? Well, we do have consistency. They're all pretty much honing in on the same area. But notice all it takes for impacts to be drastically worse is a jog to the east or the west in 30 to 50 miles, sometimes even less. And we certainly have that here. They're not all laying on top of each other. And 36 hours out, that's not terrible, but that's also doesn't give you any real comfort. Big Bend area certainly looks to be the highest impacted here, but this drifts a little bit farther to the east by 50 miles, and we're looking at even more significant storm surge values, Tampa Bay area. So here's a lesson on the storm cone, the forecast cone, and why, if you're not in the cone, you should still pay very close attention to the storm, because impacts extend far outside of the cone. I talked about that as we get closer to the impact time, that the cone narrows because forecast confidence grows. But the impacts stretch still way far outside of it. Here's a perfect example. Tropical storm force winds in the yellow here extend very far outside of that forecast cone. By as early as 10 o'clock tomorrow night, we're already possibly seeing tropical storm force winds making it on to the Fort Myers, Sarasota, Tampa Bay area. Okay? And this area is not in the forecast cone. Keep that in mind. It lifts north, and then we see the hurricane force winds in the red there making landfall potentially around Horseshoe Beach, Cedar Cay, and then lifting inland from there. All right, let's talk about the specific impacts. All hazards are on the table here when you have a major hurricane making landfall. First, we'll talk about rainfall and flooding, freshwater flooding. 5 to 10 inches possible, maybe locally higher amounts, so flash flooding is certainly a possibility. Winds, hurricanes, you automatically assume winds will be strong. With a Category 3 hurricane potentially at landfall closer to that core, you'll see the more likelihood of seeing 100-mile-per-hour winds or greater than that. Storm surge values will be highest to the east of the landfall location where winds are onshore. National Hurricane Center saying up to 12-foot surge is possible. And again, that will depend on the exact landfall location. And a risk or a hazard that some people really forget about during landfalling hurricanes is the tornado threat. And again, that's to the east. You see a trend there? The east side of landfall location, east side of the storm, that's what we call the dirty side of a hurricane, because it's got the strongest winds, it's got the worst storm surge, and it's got the highest tornado threat. Let's look at our high-res models. I showed you the GFS and Euro. Those are larger scale models, global models. This is more high-res, and that shows us where it currently is. Again, pretty good initialization here on the western side of Cuba. As we jump ahead to tomorrow morning, Tuesday at 9:30, we're starting to see some organization here and intensification while it's still well to the southwest of Tampa Bay. As we get into tomorrow afternoon, here are the outer bands starting to pivot up and over the Florida Peninsula. This is where the tornado threat is, in the outermost bands where we already have that spin in the atmosphere. Even though the center of Idalia is still well dislocated to the south and west there, the outermost bands to the east of the center are going to bring about that tornado threat and some gusty squalls too. Here we are 9 o'clock, so sun has gone down, a strengthening Idalia here, still southwest off the coast of Tampa Bay. Jump ahead to 2:30 in the morning. We've got the center of a still intensifying Idalia. At this point, could be achieving major hurricane status, and we'll have the winds here coming in behind it out of the west to southwest, blowing water, piling it up into Tampa Bay, which is when the storm surge threat really starts to go up. It pulls away to the north, makes landfall here potentially on this high-res model around the Cedar Key area as a major hurricane just ahead of sunrise on Wednesday morning. This will be when conditions are the worst in this area. It lifts to the north, but notice it straddles the southeast coastline by Wednesday evening, so it covers a lot of ground at that point in time. But also by 8 p.m., we'll be looking at the storm surge risk for Myrtle Beach, for Charleston, anywhere to the northeast of that storm center, because the winds will be onshore at that point in time, and some very heavy rain too. Now, I mentioned the east side of the storm being the dirty side. Look at where a lot of these land areas are at that point in time. They are on the western side, which sometimes is a whole lot cleaner. Some gusty winds, yes, but the storm surge values on here will be off to the north and northeast where the winds are onshore, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about that tornado threat. Storm Prediction Center has highlighted the area in red for those spots that could see some of those twisting thunderstorms lift on through that bring about a brief weak tornado, so keep that in mind too. Now let's talk about the freshwater flooding and rainfall risk here. 5 to 10 inches possible in a large swath stretching into South Georgia, all the way into Savannah, Hilton Head, Charleston area. Freshwater on top of storm surge flooding is a real concern here in coastal South Carolina. And last but most importantly here is going to be the wind and the storm surge. Here's a look at our high-res model wind gust forecast starting at lunchtime tomorrow. Already starting to get breezy conditions along the southwest coast of Florida. We jump ahead to tomorrow evening, 9:30. Already seeing tropical storm force gusts, 39 miles per hour greater. Tropical storm force. And then we get into the overnight hours. Look what happens here right around landfall. 114 mile per hour wind gusts right at the core as the eye wall moves ashore. 50, 60, 70 mile per hour wind gusts can't be ruled out in the Tampa Bay area, all dependent on the track and its intensity at that point too. Moves over land, still a breezy day. Onshore winds continue, so the storm surge threat is there until those winds start to back down and the water can drain back out the bay, particularly in Tampa Bay. National Hurricane Center product here. Storm surge forecast, again, puts the highest values closer into the east of the landfall location, where we can get up to and over 11-foot values. All right, let's talk briefly about what's going on with Franklin before we wrap this up. I know there's a lot to talk about tonight. Thank you for tuning on in. Hurricane Franklin, 150 mile per hour winds. Thank goodness there is no land in its sights. There's the east coast of the United States. There is Bermuda. Check out the forecast track here. Well, there's Hurricane Franklin. This is just kind of a recap. And we've got Idalia there. That's going to be a Cat 1 lifting to the north. And there's Hurricane Franklin. 150 mile per hour winds. 155 is where it's supposed to peak. Right on the cusp of a Cat 5. Lifting to the north, taking a northeast turn, but should pass to the northwest of Bermuda. Fingers crossed that occurs as it moves out into the North Atlantic. All right, keep in touch on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and on TikTok. We'll have more updates as we near landfall, which again looks to occur in the Gulf Coast of Florida by the time we get to early in the morning, pre-dawn on Wednesday.